welcome to everybody who's here. Quite a lot of you will have been here 2 weeks ago when we did the first one with Keith and Graeme, when they looked at the concepts behind CCTA. And we've got a lot more people tonight as well who weren't at the first session, so welcome to you. I think Keith and Graeme have decided they aren't going to do a review of what they did last time. They're just going to move on and carry on and account for the fact that there are new people here. So just to remind you that these are the first two introductory sessions to CCTA to explore the concept and the modality. Keith and Graeme obviously generated it 21 years ago with the TAGI article, and I've written various papers since then, and CCTA has been added to and adjusted a little bit. And what we have following on from this session, starting on I think the 16th of December, is the first of the follow-on workshops on all aspects of co-creative TA, with a team of 8 of us, including Graeme and Keith, myself, and some other colleagues who all used co-creative TA in their practice. So you will be able to log on to the UCATA website and register for those. And if you're a UCATA member, you should get a MailChimp email telling you that it's open for registering. So I'm Paul Robinson. I'm actually Vice Chair of the UCATA Council, as well as a TA practitioner. I'm a PTSD in education, and I use a lot of co-creative TA in my work. In fact, I base my work on co-creative TA, hence the group of us that are doing this with Keith and Graeme. So, Keith, Graeme, do you want to introduce yourselves?
Yes, hello everybody. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Graeme Summers, co-creator with Keith of Co-Creative TA. We've been long-standing friends and colleagues, trainees in the TA world, and then moving on in our different ways. So I was a psychotherapist for almost 20 years. Also a trainer and supervisor within TA. I then made a shift of direction, and since 2005, I've been working as an executive coach and a leadership trainer. I've been involved with London Business School since 2005 as well. So that's my professional role now, but still very involved in writing and have a lot of ongoing conversations with some long-standing TA colleagues. So I'm very much connected to the TA world in that way. Keith.
That looked like a pause. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Greetings to all. Ko Helvelen te monga, ko Don te awa, ko waka oranga te waka, ke te whenua o te kawero amaki taku kāinga inaine. So I've greeted you in the Māori language, the first language of my adopted homeland, and in 2 days' time, I'm getting my citizenship here. So I'm very pleased to be speaking to you as almost a dual citizen of the UK and Aotearoa New Zealand. Yeah, short version, I've like Graeme, been involved in TA for many years. My professional background was as a social worker, so I've moved from being a social worker and political activist to psychotherapist, counsellor, psychotherapist, via being a psychiatric social worker somewhere in there, and now an academic and professor of psychotherapy at Auckland University of Technology. And yeah, I've got a friend who has a lovely answer phone message, and she says, so and so, I'm so and so, and sorry if I'm not here. I'm either busy with students or out stirring things up, and I love that. I love that message. I think I might adopt that. So I like critical thinking and stirring things up, and sometimes that gets me into trouble. But I think probably over the years it's made me more friends than enemies. But I sometimes say I've got good friends, and I've also got some good enemies. So that's all good. So looking forward to stirring things up and co-creating here, and I do want to thank you, Paul, and the team very much for being such staunch advocates of the approach. It's very humbling, actually, to because Graeme and I have been sort of, in a sense, doing our own thing for 21 years or more, actually, and to get the sort of towards the end of our careers, to get the sort of recognition that this sort of event marks is just very. I feel very touched and rather emotional about it. So thank you. Yeah, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Okay, guys. So do you want it, Graeme? Do you want to just say how you want people to contact and ask questions, or put in their curiosities, and how you're going to run the session?
Yeah. Shall I kick it off? So we've framed this as an evening with Graeme and Keith, or Keith and Graeme, whichever way you want to do it. But the idea is, for those people who were here last time, we did a kind of a whirlwind tour of the core co-creative TA ideas, and very much appreciated your interactions and responses as we went along, which really helped us talk about these ideas, albeit very briefly, hopefully in a way that was addressing your interest and curiosity. We want to slow it down a little bit tonight, perhaps, and not so much bring all of that structure in, but more create perhaps a conversational space with you. It may be that you have some curiosities, questions, comments that come either in response to our session last time around, or perhaps things you've been reading or thinking about, in other ways. So you might want to, in some ways, follow up some of what we perhaps stirred last time together 2 weeks ago, which is, a great way to be building our conversations and interactions. And I think we also wanted to make some space for perhaps reflecting on what we think of as the principles of co-creative TA. Why did we come up with those principles? That will probably lead us in. Maybe we'll share some stories with you about either our thinking or how we work together, and maybe also make space for some of your wisdom and insight, the ways in which you might have been using or playing with these ideas or making connections to other things, so that we make a space here which hopefully nourishes our interest in co-creative TA and perhaps stimulates some new thinking or new reflections, new integrations as you think about this approach, perhaps alongside others. And by way of contributing, you can either go off mute and speak to us. Fantastic, that would be lovely. Another way in which you might want to interact with us or engage with us is through the chat. Now, the way we're going to do this is that Keith and I won't be attending to the chat. We won't be reading it because we want to stay connected on screens in this way. But Paul will be looking at the chat and maybe throwing in some questions or summaries or picking some comments out and feeding that into the dialogue as well. So they're probably the two main ways in which you can interact with us as part of this learning experience. Is that clear enough? Yeah, lots of nods. Good. Keith, what would you like to say?
For holding that space, Graeme. It's interesting how because when we wrote the article, it's Summers and Tudor. It does tend to be Graeme and Keith, doesn't it? Which we sort of almost stand that way around, and then we reverse that in the book for various reasons. So it's nice that some people some people know you better, some people know me better. And this is one of the things that I'm enjoying about this time together, is that it's an opportunity for people to get to know us both, and people who know me more, you know, to get to know you more and to see us and our interaction. I guess for me, I'd quite like to just tell the story of as we came to write, or as we were writing the article back in 1998, 99, a bit about the principles and about I think we felt sort of why we've got principles. Does that might that be a good way to start, and then that might get us into the principles, or would you either sort of throw it open from the start? How do we want to go?
I think I like that idea.
Yeah.
I think what I'd like to maybe, before we move on to focusing on the principles, which might be new to some people, just maybe capture any particular reactions, follow, you know, things that might have got stirred 2 weeks ago, just to make a little bit of space for that. And maybe nobody has anything to say, but I want to make the space anyway.
Yeah.
So does anyone want to pitch in with a question, comment, follow-up, curiosity that might have been stimulated by our session 2 weeks ago? And as I said before, you can either go off mute and speak to us directly. If you want to send a message through the chat, that's also fine.
Just while people are thinking about that, that's also something that we do a lot, isn't it, Graeme? That we sort of like, we check things out, go, oh, well, I'm maybe going this way, but what do you reckon? And then you go, so that's lovely. We've been doing that a long time. And I think that does co-create something. It's a sort of little vignette of us in action.
I think it's a reflection of how we write.
Yeah.
I think we do the same thing, you know, both in passing. I mean, the book, for example, we put together, you know, from one side of the world to the other. It was all done by email. And that process of writing something, swapping, editing each other's work, you know, feeding that in, trying to make, so what's the bigger narrative? What are the threads coming through this? You know, what's different about our perspectives and what might we have in common? And to keep playing like that. We do. I think it's such a feature of our writing together.
Graeme and Keith, you've got a hand up. Rachel would like to ask a question.
Oh, brilliant. Hi, Rachel.
Hi, Graeme. Hi, Keith. Hi, everybody. I loved the session a few weeks ago, whenever it was. Thank you very much. And it really inspired me. I teach second year TA students at Metanoia Institute in London, and we had great conversations based on your workshop that I'd been to the weekend that's just gone, and we had some disagreements among us. So I said that I would ask you a couple of questions on their behalf and my behalf.
Okay, great.
So if you could, at some point in the evening, you don't have to answer it now, but two questions. One was about how you view script development in co-creative TA. You know, are there positive elements of script? Is script pathological? You know, what's your view on that?
Okay.
And the second question was, how do you view parent and child ego states linked in your model? So in the same way that Ray Little talks about relational units, do you see a link between parent and child?
Great, good questions. Keith, do you want to kick off with, do you have a response to either one of those questions?
Well, I'm going to have another person that will comment. I was wondering, I'm not sure, because I'm wondering if we're collecting them, you know, because Rachel very kindly said at some point in the evening. So I'm wondering about maybe holding those until
Okay. I'm cool with that.
I'm going back to your sort of general invitation. So if we're sort of gathering, yeah, feedback and curiosity.
Okay, great.
Maybe we
Okay,
can-
so that's fine with me. Rachel,
Yeah.
I have a request. Now, if we don't address those questions in the way that, you know, that might satisfy and solve a few fights in your training group, if we haven't done that with half an hour to go, will you give us a nudge?
Will do.
Thank you.
Definitely.
Lovely.
Lovely. Thank you.
We do have a request from Elaine to go over the principles again.
Okay, brilliant. Well, that very much overlaps with our agenda too, so that's terrific. Anything else? Comments? Questions? Anything by way of...
Ronan's got a hand up as well.
Hi, Ronan.
Hi, Graeme. How are you doing?
Great, thanks.
I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about co-transferential relating. On the back of our conversation last time, I actually looked it up and I couldn't find it in the book. Maybe I've missed it, but I couldn't find it in the book. So I wanted to hear a little bit more about co-transferential relating. How is that different from, I suppose, do you see co-transferential relating as, I suppose, pathological? Yeah.
Okay, so say a little bit more, but the particular interest is, so do we see, is that a pathological thing then? Okay, brilliant. Lovely. Thanks, Ronan. Nice to pick up the thread from last week. I know we had a very brief interaction, so it'd be nice to unpack it a little bit more. Brilliant.
Thank you.
Anything else? I mean, I think we've got plenty, but if anybody else got anything else they want to say, ask. Hello, James. Welcome. Just spotted you in the middle of the screen there. Well, the middle of my screen. It's just such an exercise in relativity, isn't it? You know, where someone is in my screen on the top right and then your screen on the bottom left. It's, well, talk about frames of reference. It's all here on Zoom.
Yeah. Hi, good to see you.
Hi, James. Okay.
I do have a question, though. I would like to hear both of you talk about empathic transactional relating.
Okay. Brilliant. So I'm making a note of these for myself. Keith might be doing it in his head, I don't know. So I'll certainly be holding you in mind, and it's not uncommon in the buzz of everything for something to drop. So please, just as I suggested to Rachel, if we're not addressing something you're curious about, give us a nudge, come back to us. Even if you've said it once, please interrupt, come back. Hey, do you remember I asked about this? What do you think? Or whatever it is. Fantastic. So Keith, that's a really interesting mix that we have here. What's your thinking about how we might proceed from here?
Well, I think in the spirit of moving on and honouring that this is part 2, I think let's go for principles. Let's go for a little bit of the background story. We will weave in stories as we always do, and then maybe, you know, we can pause and have some good discussion about those. But certainly pick up the relating script and ego states. I mean, that's almost covering all the bases, but from a different perspective. So I think that's nice.
Okay. So I tell you what I did. I was really professional in that I prepared a couple of slides even before, even though I didn't have to, and no one said I didn't even say I would. I did it anyway. So I've got a couple of slides here. One which just gives kind of an you know, almost a definition of co-creative TA. And the other which outlines our 3 principles. And I wonder if that might be useful for people who would like the visual as well as hearing it spoken. Is that okay? So how about if I share this? So my proposition here, Keith, is that I'll share this. If I talk through the first slide a little,
Yeah.
And then we hit principles on the second slide and you take it from there. How's that?
Lovely. Great.
Marvelous. Okay, so hopefully I can share my screen. Let's see what happens. Oh, whoops. I don't quite want to do that yet.
I'm curious to see your definition of co-creative TA.
Oh, right. Okay, you probably disagree with it. I know what you like, but well, I'll take the risk anyway. So, excuse me while I get my stuff sorted out.
So I'll tell them the story about the 2 introductions.
Go on, you do that while I get this ready, because I'm almost there, but you know, I just need one more second.
Once upon a time, this was as we were putting the book together. That's another story actually about the origin of the book. But when we decided that we would put the book together, and go. So pause. We'll come back to that story.
Come back to that story. Okay.
Yeah.
So this is. It's pretty well my definition. The way this is my elevator pitch. You know, what is co-creative TA? For me, it's an interpretation of TA that emphasizes ongoing mutual influence. That's how I sum it up in a short sentence. Keith, are you fighting with me, or do you agree?
Not yet. Not yet.
Not yet.
I can live with that.
Okay, cool. Also, this TA approach adds emphasis to health as well as pathology, and relational and social context, as well as personal responsibility. It also aims to combine accessibility with depth and coherence across the 4 core TA concepts of ego states, transactions, games, and scripts. Obviously, that's what we looked at last time. And I think there was that lovely comment towards the end of our session. I don't know if it was you, Sarah, who said it, but you know, an appreciation of the almost the simplicity or the accessibility, as well as some of the depth behind it. And that's something I know that's really important to both of us, I think. So the principles are going to, Keith's going to talk you through this, the principles of co-creative TA. Keith.
Okay, for people who are interested in our different nuances, I like what you said there, Graeme, and I was actually looking at the introduction, the first paragraph of my introduction to the book. I also define co-creative TA, and it's interesting, some slightly different nuances. One of which I guess is also, and I know you're big on this, is the creativity. So for me, that definition doesn't. It's good, and it doesn't quite catch the emphasis on creativity that we both have. So yeah, that may be just something for us to pick up on as we go. And it's, you know, that's how we are. We're different people, so we think and write slightly differently, but we put it together. This is lovely. So yeah, these principles, I suppose the first thing about the principles is that this is my memory, and we have different memories, as we know, is that as we were sort of almost finishing the article and putting it together and thinking, you know, and revising it, I remember saying that I was quite, partly because I've got a background in philosophy, that I was quite keen on us defining the principles by which we were pulling all this together. So it was almost like we wrote the bits about transactions, ego states, scripts, and games, but we were clearly influenced by some things. We were partly influenced by our slightly different critiques of TA and our experiences of training, but we were clearly also driven by some theories like field theory and social constructivism, and I think also actually health psychology and probably critical theory. But it almost like you know, I think we agreed that we wanted to sort of out the underlying principles, and that in itself is a bit of a critique from where I'm sitting, where sometimes people develop theory but don't sort of locate their theory either in relation to other theory like what's gone before, and don't sort of argue its place in the canon. You know, like for instance I did with the Sixth Driver article. You know, I acknowledged that the theory is, 5 drivers. So if you're adding some theory, it seems to me that it sort of behoves us to sort of locate that. And I think in that conversation, which I think mainly took place on Arnside Beach at this point, we realized that actually we did have these 3 principles that had in effect driven us to give the detail. We sort of gave the detail on top, but these were the principles. Does that make sense to you, Graeme? Is that your?
Yeah, probably slightly different emphasis in that. And it might be talking about the same thing, but just from a different angle. So, because I think your story is more about, okay, what were the principles we were carrying that were driving this from the start, and then becoming conscious of it. And I almost have a slightly different take on it. I have a sense of having done that much work together, having talked endlessly, written, all that stuff that goes on when you're involved in the process, and then it's almost as towards the end of that process, reflecting on it and say, well, so what are we saying? If we were to try and distill all this into 3 principles, what would they be? And it's so I kind of more have it as a distilling process, like after almost towards the end of the event. Okay, so what's this been about? What are we? If it was to have 3 principles, what would they be and why? So, and I think so. Interesting, interesting takes. One's prospective, the other's retrospective, but I think we there's a big overlap there.
Yeah.
That's why we write together, because there's a big overlap.
Yes, that's right, and we emphasize different things. So we did come up with 3 principles, and what's interesting, I think, over the years is that they've been, we've tested them out, and there's this idea about the necessity and sufficiency of theory, and they do seem to cover the basis of what we're trying to say. So the first principle, and we'll probably do this as a bit of an interleave as well, is the principle of we-ness. So this essentially speaks to some of what we were talking about last time, which is, challenging the pathologizing of we language and symbiosis, realizing that there are more we cultures than me cultures in the world, that, a lot of people do have a more sort of collective mindedness and so on. And essentially, as you've summarized it beautifully here, that the relationship or the relating that goes on between 2 people, and we're particularly talking about therapy, but also true of other applications, is more potent than the potency or the impotency of the particular individuals involved. So that for us, the power is certainly not in the guru therapist, or the patient or the client alone. It's actually in the in-between. It's the energy that that comes up between us and so on. So that essentially would be my today's riff on the principle of we-ness. That and I guess it sort of follows or it neatly feeds into the next principle of shared responsibility. But do you want to say anything more about we-ness, Graeme? Should we I was just thinking we do these pretty quickly to throw them.
No, I think you've said it well. I think it probably, in hindsight, since writing this, I think what I'm increasingly aware of is just how much neoliberal agenda, is based around the cult of the individual. Somehow it's about your individual progress or your individual achievements. It's all, and there's something really off about that. It's kind of it's out of balance. So I think of us as shifting the emphasis or shifting the balance in TA.
And that's a big. I agree with you, and I also think that's quite a big agenda, isn't it? Because if we look historically, ego, Burns' idea about ego states came out of ego psychology, which was very much, it was sort of forged in the sort of that American New Deal, individualistic, post Second World War, all discovering ourselves and so on, and yeah, highly individual and individualistic, and no wonder that the main aim of TA is autonomy. And I think this we-ness, it's also no accident that we've then got, particularly influenced by my person-centered language as well, got into this idea of homonymy, the balance between autonomy, the idea of self-determination, and homonymy, the idea of the drive to belonging. So I think that what you're alerting us to, Graeme, is very important, and is a big sort of almost psychological and social political agenda about we need more we-ness in the world and less I-ness and me-ness in the world.
Shall I kick off this next principle, Keith, and please join in as you need to. So one
responsibility for this presentation.
So I think something that really flows from the idea of giving emphasis to we-ness, the power, the potency, the value of we-ness, is the idea of shared responsibility. And actually, we've cast it on with a positive spin on here, but the same applies to trouble and difficulty as well. So I think it's worth acknowledging both. But what we kick off with, because we were really interested in balancing an emphasis on health as well as pathology in TA, so that the positive aspects of relationship are co-created and co-maintained by active contributions from both all individual participants. So it's this notion that in order to make something happen in the relationship, whether that's good or bad, we're probably sharing a responsibility in that process. And one of the things that Keith and I really noticed as we look back at the TA literature at that time was that there seemed to be almost two polar positions in the TA literature. So the idea of personal responsibility. I'm responsible for the decisions I've made, the redecisions I might make now, an emphasis on the individual power, and on the one hand, so that's very much rooted in classical and redecisional TA. And then I think what we were witnessing was the emergence of Richard Erskine's work in particular, where he was putting a lot of emphasis on the importance of empathy, the practitioner being empathy, drawing a lot on the ideas from self-psychology, from Kohut, and where the emphasis may be more towards on my responsibility as therapist or facilitator, that somehow actually the main responsibility here for your growth is how empathic I can be to your situation or circumstances. So we saw this kind of shift, almost like somehow it was all the individual's responsibility, and then somehow it's, well, hang on, it's about how empathic the therapist can be. There's something missing there. What was missing for us was a way of thinking about the shared responsibility within the relationship, within the we-ness, either for better or worse, and how we might use that in a constructive way and create a conceptual space for that. So that's why we had that as our second principle. Anything you want to add to that, Keith, or qualify?
Only something that you, I think, originally articulated, which was about the shared responsibility doesn't mean a sort of rigid 50-50. It sometimes means that, that maybe the therapist will take more responsibility. Sometimes, we need to maybe do some psychoeducational work to explain even, how therapy works and so on, and we might do more, and at other times we might do less or invite the client to do more. So it's not sort of, this sort of rigid
and it's true. If you're working in a professional capacity with people as an educator, OD consultant, coach, therapist, then you also have a level of professional accountability and responsibility that never goes away. So nonetheless, we can still think about this idea of shared responsibility and I think in a useful way.
That's been very influential to me. I think, I'm always interested in what gets co-created. I remember working with somebody in a workshop, and they were saying, I think they said something like, "I'm sorry, I'm a bit deaf. Can you speak up?" And we worked with that a little bit, and I was saying, "Oh, yes, I will speak up," because I have quite a low voice, soft voice, and I can sometimes drop, and so that's my bit of the responsibility. And I was also interested that the person apologized, like that somehow they were making themselves wrong, and it was a sort of imposition. And so, look, if I'm not projecting my voice, that's my responsibility. And maybe your responsibility is to speak up, but rather than getting into blaming the other or demanding of or self-blaming, blaming oneself. So I think that was a good example. So I'm always curious about what's my part in this process, and what can I do something different about. I was also thinking, as you talked earlier, I've been thinking a lot about Eric Berne's metaphor of the splinter. For some reason, I've been reading that article again, the splinter chart, and thinking that's interesting that when he says the first duty of the doctor is to take the splinter out of the toe, that's taking responsibility for fixing something, before we get into the psychodynamics of how come you always get a splinter in your toe. But it's basically saying, got a splinter in your toe, I'll help get that out. So
it's literally a wooden leg, don't you think, having a splinter in the toe?
Nice one.
It's a good one, wasn't it? Present centered development. Keith, tell us about that.
Well, Graham, one of the things that you and I got upset about in our training and some of our experiences was this assumption that if you have a problem in the past, that you've somehow got to go back into the past to resolve it. And famously, in terms of the sort of reparenting work and rechilding work that's around in TA, and the idea that it's never too late to have a happy childhood. You can go back in your inner child part of yourself, or set up with workshops. I went on a number of workshops at Metanoia, where I trained also, where people would contract for reparenting and say, I'd like you to be that dad that never played with me, and so we'd have a little game in a regressed state and so on. And I just don't think it's necessary. I think philosophically it's problematic, and also it doesn't last, because the logic of it is you then have the next problem that you have to go back and regress and do it again. So you're in this sort of permanent loop of past centered cure. And the phenomenal, influenced by phenomenology and the phenomenology of the present, and some people like Daniel Stern's work, as well as some other philosophers, suggest that our past exists in the present. So I have this sort of phrase which you picked me up a bit, and we've had a dialogue about this, about digging around. You don't need to go digging around in the past. This is my phrase, because the past will be in the present. When we have a hiccup, or there's a rupture or something, that's happening in the present, so that we can develop in the present, rather than believing that we have to go back. And so to me, the sort of antidote to that slogan, it's never too late to have a happy childhood, is something much less pithy, but it's something like, it is too late to have the happy childhood that you didn't have, but it's not too late to grieve that loss and to co-create happy and fulfilling relationships in the present for the future. So there's this sort of idea of, there was things that I didn't get in my childhood that I can't get, and I have to let that go. I can grieve it, mourn it, whatever. This is where I think Freud's idea about the distinction between mourning and melancholia is very useful. mourn it rather than get into melancholia and depression about it, but then create a present that is more satisfying and that has different relational, that has enhancing relationships that create new relational possibilities.
Breathe out, Keith.
Pause.
I like that summary. It's a lovely summary. I guess one thing I might add to it is I would see that as an interweaving process. I think often the process of grieving for what's lost and creating something new and desirable, I think that often interweaves. It's like I certainly know sometimes when I'm getting something, I'm getting the kind of happy experiences I might want now, and that can evoke a sadness for maybe not having had enough of it before. And so sometimes, even getting something that's really important to you now can surprisingly evoke as much grief as pleasure, because partly we're still grieving for maybe something that was important to us that was missing earlier on. But nice summary.
Thank you, my friend.
So, shall we throw it out to people and see what reactions they might have? And we might even find a way of weaving in some of these questions that were posed to us earlier on at the beginning of the session here. Lovely. So again, please, however you'd like to connect with us, go off mute, say it to us, or send something in the chat if you want to. The other thing I want to hold open as a possibility, Keith, is perhaps even making some space for breakout rooms. So that's a possibility if you want to pick that up and use it at some point. But I
want to check in with my neighbour Elaine, because I think she put that on the agenda. Did that response?
Yeah, no, that was really, really helpful for me. I think I do have a question. Shall I start?
Yeah, go Elaine.
In terms of past, I really like the way Graeme said there's a kind of interweaving. And I had a lovely experience with someone recently sitting in a threesome where the person's fear of getting what she wanted was related to the amount of grief that it really was coming now and hadn't been there all those years. You were exactly what you said. But I do wonder about co-creative TA and the patterning. So with trauma clients, the patterning of the thinking, the patterning of the expectation of what comes from others, which then affects the interpretation of what others are doing, which then affects what the individual puts into and contributes. So I agree about leaving the past behind, but how does co-creative, I just want to hear a bit more about how you work with that, that default that is often part of what people are doing in their difficulty of leaving the past behind.
Great question. Great. Yeah, beautifully put. Graeme, do you want to?
Let me just throw up a parody perhaps first. So I don't think either Keith and I are saying, oh, stop talking about the past, just leave it behind, let's focus on other things. So I just want to be really clear, we're not saying that. I think these principles perhaps interweave a little here, because I think in the we-ness, hopefully in our professional role, we are in part creating the psychological safety in which people can share what they're experiencing, at a phenomenal, just share what's going on for them or whatever they get preoccupied with. And I think what you're describing here is a trauma reaction of the kind of being locked in those perhaps overactive emotional states that were stimulated earlier on, and we still go there instinctively to it, and we might have a whole load of negative thoughts about ourselves or other people that go with that. I think how I would think about that as perhaps as a healing process is one, doing what you can to create the psychological safety for someone to share their experience. I think you as a practitioner being able to bring the compassion and empathy, which hopefully the person can begin to associate with the pain, that they can take something else in the we-ness and in the power of the healing relationship that doesn't take away the pain, but it adds some sort of compassion or recognition or acknowledgement. And I think that process of just beginning to let someone alongside you in that kind of place is the softening. The way I would phrase it, though, the way I would think about that conceptually in terms of what's happening in TA is that in that process of someone allowing another human being to be alongside them where they feel most hurt and most defended, but allowing another human being to be alongside them with that and experience that, I think of that as very much present-centered adult work. In that moment, that person is expanding their adult just a little bit more to allow more pain to be experienced and held in this relationship here, rather than re-experiencing that experience of having the pain but being all alone with it. So that's a very quick kind of intuitive putting words together, trying to respond to your question, Elaine. Am I getting close to what you're looking for?
Yes, I think it's beautiful, and absolutely I agree. And I think, Richard would have talked about that as a kind of juxtaposition.
He would, yes.
Going back to the old corrective experience. But I think it links up, and I'm going to hand over to Ronan. I hope he'll speak, because I think it might also link up with transference. And I was looking at a thing online, so Borderliner Notes with Frank Yeomans, about the way a client can put on you in that relating something that it's going to take time for them to lift that off you and recognize your loveliness. And so it comes back to and I'm hoping I'll get a bit from Ronan as well. But yes, a beautiful answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'd just like to just to clarify to people who don't know, Elaine was referring to Richard Erskine then, who talks about juxtaposition, the experience of feeling grief when you get something that you want that you haven't had before. So I just wanted to acknowledge Richard Erskine, properly in this forum. Thank you for that. So
and the other thing,
were you making a bid here to Ronan, Elaine? So Ronan, you've gone off mute. You're going to say something, aren't you?
Well, I guess what I want to ask, I suppose, is, so one of the things I think we talked about last time was that is kind of not working in the transference. I think that's how I understood it. And I guess what I'm trying to get my head around is how do you understand the difference between working in the transference and co-transferential relating, particularly around psychic energy, for example?
I'm happy to respond to that, Keith, or do you want to jump in?
No, you go. I was articulating a response because I was thinking, I appreciate, Elaine, you making the link, and it's a nice segue. We'll keep in mind other questions about the principles, but maybe move into things about transactions. But you go for it, and I might add something.
Okay. Do I think of working in the transference as being the same as the co-transferential? I suppose I do in part. I don't know if you remember the diagram that we had last time. Am I still sharing my screen? I'm not, am I? Of the two psychological fields coexisting. So in other words, we have our adult field, and yet we also have this parent-child, or these other psychological fields that are more about the past that gets reenacted. So the way in which I think about that then is that of course we're going to be playing out the past psychological field, the co-transference. And yes, to answer a question you had earlier on, I would think about that is the pathology. That is the, by what I mean, the problem, the hurt, the whatever gets stirred, that's kind of unresolved pain and gets acted out. That would be in the that parent-child psychological field, or the archaic psychological field. But at the same time, we're also creating at least enough of an adult field that we can agree to meet once a week and turn up, at the very least. But there's much more to it than that. The way in which I think about healing is that we need to be creating enough of that adult field to be able to contain what happens, what's being acted out at that psychological level. So the enactments that happen in therapeutic relationships and other relationships, we need to be able to have enough adult field and be able to strengthen that so we can contain that. And it's that process of being able to compassionately contain that, learn from that, and somehow expand the adult field to allow more feelings, more open relating, more connection, rather than reverting to previous defenses. That applies to the therapist as well as the client. So that's how I would think of it. I think the healing is through the adult contact, as it contains, and through that containment expands what's possible in the here and now, in the here and now relationship. Am I answering your question, Ronan? You're off mute.
Sorry, yeah. So yes, and what I'm trying to get, what I'm trying to clarify is, I suppose I understand the integrating adult as where the psychic energy is, and I think maybe implied that in the archaic parent and child ego state there isn't psychic energy. And so if that was the case, I suppose I'm struggling to use that in thinking about when I experience an enactment in whatever capacity, then there is an awful lot of psychic energy, which I don't think is adult.
Yeah,
I agree.
I agree too. I wouldn't suggest there's no psychic energy in parent or child. I think there's a lot. It's just fixated.
Yeah.
So that and I think that the process of healing is one of being able to create enough safety that the relationship can hold more.
Okay,
and
so I think
that yeah.
Maybe that helps crystallize the question that I have in my head is, I suppose, what is the difference between, so when we say that the parent and child is fixated, the parent and child is fixated, there's something, it's not dynamic. And I misinterpret that as therefore.
Keith and I have had this debate in the book. And Keith's critique of my article on this subject was that, no, the way you put it is not dynamic. And I counter that and say, whoa, hang on a bit. It takes a lot of energy to keep those defenses in place. It's a dynamic process. And what, depending on the context, depending on who you're talking with, depending on how much sleep you had the night before, these are all some of the variables that might have a bearing on how much you might be open and how much you might shut down. It's a wholly dynamic process. But it's still, for me, the idea, what I mean by fixated is that it's You know, it's probably a regular enough, you know, of a pattern of actually shutting down in response to certain situations or contexts when it feels threatening. So that's the sense in which it's fixed. We lock something in, we fix it in, rather than we have it more open and available. But again, like all of these things, it's not one or the other. It's a process we go through. We open up, we shut down, we open up a bit more. We've got one step forward, you know, two steps. It's a dynamic process. So that's the way in which I reconcile that.
Okay, that's really, I think the definition of how you understand fixated really helped me.
Okay.
Good.
Kind of understand what now that was the difficulty I was having is I interpreted that as non-dynamic, no psychic energy.
No, that's certainly not how either of us think of it.
No.
Keith, do you want to say more?
I just wanted to clarify, perhaps maybe for others as well, is the idea of the co-transferential bit of relating is an acknowledgement that the therapist may bring something to the party, and I have a particular beef about the amount of weight that's given in psychodynamic circles to countertransference, which quite a lot of which feels like it's blaming the client, and it's I'm feeling this as the therapist because the client is, you know, projective identification and stuff like that. So we wanted to acknowledge the and I think it's Donna Orange's work and Stollerow and these people who talk about co-transference, and therefore that we may be in that transferential relating field, but that's, you know, the idea is to get out of it. So that's why I say about, you know, not working in the transference, but actually wanting to come out of it, wanting to say, and to acknowledge transference and the usefulness of the information that gives us, but not to be perpetuating it. And in that sense, we're very different from, say, traditional psychodynamic ways of working, which tend to promote transference as a vehicle for healing. I'm completely opposed to that. Like, no, that's the point of therapy, is to get out of talk about your transferential relationships, but get out of it. You know, that's the thing about the splinter and the and to talk about those as different relational possibilities. We can go on perpetuating, you know, a thing where I'm the, you know, unavailable father, or we can do something different, and the doing something different is the healing. I'm completely with Carl Rogers' critique and other people's critique of undue, you know, transference being a bit of a thing where, you know, psychodynamic psychotherapists sort of set that up so therefore therapy has to take forever and so on. So that's probably stirred a few things up.
Thank you,
I'm
Elaine
and Ronan,
Elaine and Ronan, for getting us going. That's brilliant. So just appreciate it. You know, this can only happen with you pitching in with your curiosities or comments, perhaps objections, just whatever's driving.
I'm wondering if logically whether we go to. I've just seen something in the chat, but I'll leave Paul to be responsible for that. I'm just wondering if it then makes sense to go on to James's point about empathic transactional relating, or parent. We could go to the parent and child thing that Rachel brought up, because that kind of links with perhaps the point that we've made about psychic energy.
Mm-hmm.
And I can tell the story about you not allowing me to go for my 2 ego state model.
Yeah. Yes, true. I did put an injunction on that. It's true.
You did, yeah.
Perhaps Rachel, can we return to you then and pick up this question of the parent and child? Can you perhaps restate the question so we're all on board, and the question might even have been refined a little in response to what's happened so far?
Yeah, I guess it's kind of really how it's fitting in with transferential relating, I think, and thinking about Ray Little's relational units,
mm-hmm.
And the interjection of the relationship, if you like. Wondering whether whether in co-creative TA you're seeing them linked in that way. So if I guess the way that I work is which I know Keith will completely object to, but I will use different aspects of co-creative TA and the transferential relationship, Hagen and Sills.
Sure.
And often I will use Hagen and Sills to understand pathology, to understand, you know, what might be going on in the child and parent ego states. However, you know, not staying in those dynamics, as Keith just said, but to come out of it. So I'm wondering whether you can use different, or you allow yourselves to use different psychodynamic models like the relational units to understand the pathology in those parent and child egos.
Okay. So Ray Little's work on relational units, Ray has been very much influenced by Richard Erskine over the years, and Richard Erskine, Ray, and Keith and I are broadly aligned in terms of our thinking about ego states. It was Richard Erskine that really pioneered the idea of the integrated adult, the idea of parent and child being the pathological aspects of our personality, and that, you know, Richard even suggested that, you know, in the process of therapy we should be shrinking our parent and child. So it's not that we should be healing them or changing them, we should be shrinking them. And we kind of took the logical extension of that and really talked about, and expanding adult. So in terms of Richard Erskine, in terms of Ray Little, very aligned. So Ray Little talks about structuring and non-structuring internalizations, and the structuring internalizations. This is based on the work of Rubens, which in turn is based on Fairbairn. It's the idea that I have an experience, I can't manage it, I can't tolerate it. Whatever reason, I don't have the support, it's too much, overwhelming. The way in which I try and deal with that unmanageable experience is I split myself. And that's the splitting, that's the kind of ego splitting that Fairbairn talks about, and that Rubens talks about in this structuring, non-structuring way, and Ray Little builds on that to talk about relational units and TA. So wholly aligned with Ray on that front. So I find a lot of synergy between Richard Erskine's model of ego states, Ray Little's work on relational units. I find Helena and Charlotte's work, although they're dear friends, and Keith and I were with them in a peer group for about 5 years, but they furrowed their path and we furrowed ours, and they kind of took different directions. And in some ways they're quite incompatible, I think. So yes, of course you can move between them, but it takes mental gymnastics to do it. So I had to do it when I was a TA trainer, because I felt an obligation for people to understand different models of ego states and where they come about, where they overlap, where they're incompatible. Since I've stopped being a TA trainer, I'm quite happy just to go with a way that makes sense to me, and where people are using models of ego states that are just completely rewriting, you know, it's a completely different way of thinking about ego states. I find it too hard to juggle all those things at the same time. It's like trying to speak 6 languages at once, and it's too much. So my preference is I pick what makes sense to me and draw on authors that in some ways speak in a language that also makes sense to me. If it's too incompatible yet using the same language, it's confusing. That's my answer. Keith?
Yeah, I love your how you put that, Rachel. I don't have any objection to people use, you know, similar to what you just said there, Graeme. You know, if you find it helpful to use different models of parent and child to understand pathology, I think that's all good. I just don't have much interest in getting into, you know, P P naught 0, P naught plus 1. You know, that does my head in. So I have to go, you know, find the dictionary and sort of, it's just to me it's too complex and a bit unnecessary. And it's interesting, I think, also that we over the years of TAs I think can be criticized for spending too much time on understanding pathology and not enough time on health. But essentially, I think that going back to your original question or original debate in the training group, you know, for me, the parent and child are linked in that they're both metaphors that describe something that's represented in the past that's not working. And hence, I think the logic of our model, and this is where Graeme and I had to debate about, are we actually proposing a 2 ego state model, which is basically present-centered ego state or way of working, way of being, and a past-centered state. I'm not sure if it makes, then this is anathema within TA, so probably this is a point that I might get kicked out of the TA community, would say, actually, what is the difference between the parent and the child? The only difference is that we talked about the child as the sort of experiencing past, and the parent being another aspect of the experiencing past, but from the sort of extra psyche. So, you know, to me, it's either present-centered, integrating adult, or past-centered stuckness, which is parent and or child. And they're often related, as we know, because reinforcing messages and experiencing and so on. So that's that bit. And then the other bit you mentioned in your elaboration was about Ray and the idea of the introjected relationship. I don't want people to introject me. I want people to integrate themselves. So I'm quite particular about when people often use the word modeling. I did that to model something. No, that modeling comes from cognitive theory, again, behavioral theory, where somebody is doing something in order that somebody introjects, in order that they follow, the person, usually a child, follows them. Whatever I do, I just do. It's not with the intention that somebody introjects it and swallows it through introjection. If what I do is helpful and people feel more expanded as a result, then they're doing the integrating. So any model that says, you know, set something up to introject, particularly if it's going into the parent, new parent, blah, 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 that doesn't make sense to me. And I object to that sort of philosophically and politically. So, and you know, I'm not saying that it doesn't work. It's just it doesn't work for me, and I can articulate a, you know, objection to that. So if people say, "Oh, yeah, that was really good the way you modelled that," I'm going, oh, "No, I might have demonstrated something, but you do the integrating. I'm not modelling something so that you're introjecting." And I think that's quite a big difference.
I think you should emphasize the point by waving your finger. You do. Thank you.
I
am not. You should not. Yeah. Okay. I'm making my point.
Yeah. I'm demonstrating with passion.
So can I just check something with you? So do you see yourself in terms of Martha Stark's model of therapeutic operation? Do you still see yourself as a two-person psychology? Or
yeah, I see myself definitely two-person, and I've, as you probably know, I've added or suggested the addition of a two-person plus psychology, which accounts for people integrating from the environment. You know, I think a beautiful sunset is probably more therapeutic than sometimes what I might offer. That's two-person plus psychology. But yeah, definitely within her taxonomy, I'm a two-person guy. Certainly not one person, and certainly not 1.5 person, where I've got this magical corrective experience for you.
So I think I'm always two-person in philosophy, or at least I strive to be. I think I might move between 1.5 and 2 person in terms of behavior, depending on the context. Certainly, I work in some educational context, where the script is so strong about their expectations that sometimes I will go with that just to build relationship, just to fit in, just to conform enough so they let me stay a little bit longer. And then then from there, my way of relating would probably move towards the two person. But I think in terms of behavioral range, all valid, and it all depends on context. And sometimes I might be moving into a one person defensively as a frame of reference, but I think sometimes it's a valid choice in terms of the context that you're in or the expectations someone's coming with. So that's
sure.
just another way of mixing it up.
I'm not convinced.
Rachel, I'm really curious as to what do you think some of your students might be making of this?
I guess it's only really I can only speak for myself what I'm
sure.
of it until I go back to them. I'm interested in your mental gymnastics, as if that's a negative, and what you're just saying in terms of sometimes working from a 1.5 to I think that takes mental gymnastics, and yes. I think for me I want to have mental gymnastics.
Point taken. I like that. I love that reframe. It's brilliant. Yeah.
I think it's a question of choosing the what do you have in a gym, choosing which mechanism you're on, isn't it? The parallel bars or the horse or whatever. I love mental gymnastics. It's just that I'm not, and I disagree with Master Stark about this, because one of the things she says about her taxonomy is, it's good to be able to move between all three. I think there are epistemological contradictions between a 1 person, 1.5 person, and 2 person thing. Like take the issue of permissions, traditionally issued from the therapist's parent to the client's child. And it's like, it's okay to feel anxious, it's okay not to feel anxious, so it's this group is safe, blah blah blah, all of that. If you take a 2-person perspective, I think you wouldn't give a permission, because it's a contradiction in terms, because I'm not setting myself up to be that powerful or that knowledgeable. I am interested in co-creating an environment in which people expand, and if they say that they've taken a permission, that's very different, hence which I elaborated in my article on the 3 Ps. That's a very different way of thinking about. So I think I'm with you in the mental gymnastics. It's just that I'm not interested in there are some gymnastics I'm less interested in.
But if you say, I think it's okay to do that, or I'm comfortable doing that, does that
that's irrelevant? No, I think it's irrelevant. No, if somebody says, classic one in terms of group safety, and the therapist supposed to, traditionally supposed to say, this is safe. I have no idea if this group is safe for you. Maybe it may be hugely anxiety provoking. So I'm interested in saying, let's work with that. Another example in the TA world is people saying, I want to do some exam preparation with you, and I want to not feel anxious in the exam. I can't do that. I can help you be anxious and survive. I'm not going to buy a contract that's a stop contract and that says that I can give you enough permission that you won't feel anxious. So I just think it's not relevant what I think. What's relevant is what the client is experiencing, and that we can process that. I think to say, I think it's okay, is a sort of sneaky way. It's a slightly removed way of saying, it's okay, because I don't know. I don't know if it's okay for you to feel anxious.
Well, I could argue that it's something that I can bring from my adult to say, in my adult experience, I think it's okay, or I think that there is a way to feel relaxed or grounded. It doesn't mean that anxiety is not possible.
Well, we have to disagree. You could say that, and possibly you do. I just don't think. To me, it's not. actually, I'd probably say that's not mentally gymnastic enough. I think I'm more interested in well, so you know, you're anxious. You're looking to me to make you less anxious. That what's going on here? That I'm more interested in being curious about what's going on. That so that you know.
I think this might be leading us along in terms of expressed interest here. So I'm thinking about James. I'm thinking about you. You're curious about empathic transactional relating. So you brought that in as a curiosity, because I think you are perhaps getting into methodology here, Keith. Or you're sharing. Well, it seems to me that you're sharing something about, what you would do, what you wouldn't do, perhaps how you work or how you think. So I'm wondering if that links to perhaps to your curiosity, James, about empathic transactional relating.
Well, I think it does relate to what Rachel and Ronan are talking about, and I think it's what I see, and I'd be interested to hear both you and Keith talk about it, about there is a philosophical shift here to a much more explicit concentration on the experience of the client and what they're bringing into the co-created relationship, and a deliberate stepping back from using one or 1.5 person psychology and staying in the two-person plus within the co-created relationship as the healing basis.
Mm-hmm.
And you write about that. I think it's Keith that writes about that in his chapter on empathy, about empathic transactional relating. And I guess I'm interested in, well, what does that look like?
Thank you, James. Keith, you want to pick that one up?
Yeah, I mean, the reason I wrote that is, I suppose there's a logical progression for me from the first article to the article I wrote on ego states. I think I mentioned last week, Graeme said, oh, we should do that, or we should do that. So I went away and did that. And then to me, the next thing was about looking at the method and methodology of co-creative. TA and Graeme had written the dynamic ego states, and around the same time I was thinking more about empathy, and so I wrote 2 linked articles on empathy. One was called Understanding Empathy, which was more about the history of empathy in TA and outside of TA, and then there was the Empathy, a Co-Creative Perspective, in which I was very keen to say, okay, so again, given my philosophical leanings, to say, so what is the methodology? And essentially I'd see the methodology, the philosophy, the sort of philosophical ideas or concepts that I would draw on to describe co-creative TA are 3. First is partnership. This is a partnership model, and I can think of that both psychologically and also politically in this country. It's about partnership between Māori and non-Māori, and that drives quite a lot of thinking about how we conduct or should conduct ourselves. So this is a partnership model between the client and the therapist, and that sort of implies an equal partnership and an adult partnership. So we're challenging ideas about the infantilization of clients and trainees. The second thing is about what I call the phenomenology of the present, which links to the idea of the present-centered development, and is very much drawing on ideas of the importance of the present. Go back to me, 19th century psychologist, but I particularly found in people like Daniel Stern's wonderful book called The Present Moment. I'm writing more about. That's my sort of one of my next projects, is to really unpack that more. So to sort of say this, and this the phenomenon. So the experience of the past is in the phenomenology of the present. My feelings, my thoughts, my recollections, my memories of my difficult childhood or whatever is in the present. So that's what we can look at.
That's a nice phrase, Keith. Lovely.
Thank you. And then the other is about the I suppose it's broadly relationship or relating. It's the fact that the therapy is the ongoing process of, actually Roger's talked about therapy being the ongoing process of diagnosis, but it's the diagnosis in the experience of the client, not the intellect, the tradition of the clinician. And I'd probably say something a little bit similar in terms of it's a relationship model. The principle is relationality and the co-creating of that. So those are to me the sort of some of the methodological things, and then what follows from that is, and I go into it in the original article and in the chapter about, okay, so what does that look like? It looks like expanding adult, it looks like being attentive, it looks like being engaged, and those sort of things. So that's a very brief summary of what I would see as some of the methodology. And of course, Graeme took issue, which was a lovely issue, because I was big on empathy and still am. And one of Graeme's criticisms was, you don't talk enough about play. It's like, there's empathy, yeah, that's all good, but there's also play. And as you can see, we're very playful with each other. And I thought, damn, I wish I'd thought of that.
That's why you need me around, man. That's why I
need you around. Yeah, I can still beat you.
Well, perhaps I can say a little bit about that. I mean, in terms of, see, one of the things that actually I wasn't really keen on Kohut's work or the self-psychologists, which seemed to me to have almost a sort of relentless emphasis on empathy, and to me that fits more within Stark's 1.5 person psychology frame, so that's in some ways that's my reservation about stating the methodology is empathy. And I know you unpack your thinking about that and differentiate between what different people mean by that as you go into it. Nonetheless, for me, there's something about this process, and we've talked about it before, about grieving. I think grieving what's not worked, grieving what's gone wrong, grieving our insults, whatever's happened to us, neglect, whatever's been painful. There's the grief, and there's the opening up and the willing to risk creating new experiences with others. And I think that empathy perhaps maybe has more relevance, more need in relation to the grief, and acknowledging that, attending to that, contextualizing that, providing a compassionate frame that someone can internalize. But I think we need to be able to play to create new. We need to be able to play. We need to be able to take risks to create new experience. For me, that's so critical. And if we, because it is such, it's the energy that kind of makes new things possible. So I think we need both. And the other person I'm thinking of as I speak is the work of Glyn Hudson-Allers. I don't know if any of you know of her work. She's a clinical psychologist, and she makes links. She talks about attachment theory. How do we get out of our insecure attachment? How we go around those negative loops? How do we build a secure attachment? Particularly when we might be caught and absorbed by rage, fear, anxiety, all sorts of things. And she links this to Panksepp's ideas of emotional systems. And she's really saying exactly that. We need care, and we need play. That's our pathway, is the way she conceptualizes that. It's a really, really nice book. I do recommend you take a look at it. But it's, we're really exploring this. What hurts? Where do we get stuck? Where do we collapse? Where do we defend? And what would help? What would help us get off those loops where we keep reinforcing those experiences and digging a deeper hole? What helps us build a bridge to some new possibility and new possibilities? And she's naming care and play as essential in that process. For me, that instinctively makes sense. So I offer that really as a counterbalance to Keith's emphasis on empathy. I think play is essential for creating new possibilities.
Would you say her name again, the author?
Glyn Hudson Allez, Allez.
So if you go to play, that means there is a possibility. So play comes with risk.
Yes.
And you talk about risk. You talked about kind of creating a space where you can play and take and have different relational possibilities. I think you call it.
Yes.
Right. So with that also therefore comes a high possibility or probability of a rupture.
Sure.
Okay.
It's going to happen.
And so I guess what I'm and I suppose the remark that James made that I think threw me a little bit, James, is that it's more client-centered. And so where I'm left is I'm thinking, so how do you think about the therapist sharing their subjective experience, self-disclosure, whether it is biographical or about their internal experience of the therapist? Do you see that as helpful or not?
I think it's inevitable.
Okay.
I think we often create this bit of a loop. Interesting to me, what I noticed the default is don't share, and do you take the risk to share or not? There are risks in not sharing also. If you've grown up with a parent figure that's just not interested in you, that is very withholding, that doesn't share their experience, that doesn't help you regulate your affect by sharing theirs, or in a way that it would allow the co-regulation. If you have maybe a very withholding parent, is that not what you'd be reenacting in a therapeutic relationship, where the default position is I keep stum? So I think that's just an interesting observation in the way that we talk about self revelation as the dangerous thing. Well, hang on, we might be a bit blinkered about that. I think whatever we do, we could cause harm, and we could heal. We can make a contribution to something that is an enactment that maybe deepens the enactment rather than contains it. And we could do that by withholding. We could do it by oversharing. I think we could. So I think the important question is, what am I doing or not doing, and is that helping or is it getting in the way? For me, that's a more fundamental question than is it bad for me to share? Should I share this or not share it? There's some of my thoughts about that. Keith?
I wonder whether it's just a thought. In terms of a partnership, how would you decide to share or not? I mean, would you ask someone, is this a good place for me to put in my response? Because I'm also thinking in terms of play, thinking back to my days as a play center mother, about the dynamics of the power of who builds the play. You see a child get an idea and start to build, and you can see sometimes with other children, they pick up and move in with a dynamic that the power may be coming from one place. I'm not sure if I'm putting this very clearly, but it takes me back again to the ideas about power and power in relationship, which frankly I find extremely difficult.
But inevitable.
Yeah.
We were challenged around, particularly I think around the second principle, actually, by our colleague Sue Eusden and my partner. So she said, so are you trying to tell me in this co-creative model that that children who experience abuse? Are they co-creating it? Are they partly responsible for that? That's a brilliant challenge she made to myself and Keith, which did really get us thinking about, well, you know, first thought is, of course not, but actually, how do we articulate that? And so we did actually put a chapter on power into the book, where we were articulating our understanding of this and the way we thought about this, and you know, like any ideas, co-creative TA could be used well or badly. So if you wanted to twist these ideas and used it to, in some perverse way, to justify abusing a child, then yes, we probably can't stop someone doing those, you know, twisting things in that way. But what we could do was write a chapter about power and how we thought about power, how we were tracking how that had been talked about in the TA literature, and really say, you know, our response to that is not to diminish our power, but it's always to be conscious that how do we use power with people in a partnership? How do we use power with? And rather than have power over, or perhaps even, you know, squash my power entirely because I'm trying to force myself into some therapeutic model that doesn't really fit me, or, you know, what would be helpful. So I think it's a great question, Elaine. It's like, it's a great issue to be confused about sometimes, or to be asking questions about. And for me, the fundamental question again is, yes, I have power. Am I using it well or badly? Yes, we have power. Are we using it well or badly? And how do we know? How do we catch the edges of that? How do we, you know, challenge each other in the partnership to actually co-regulate us, hopefully get better ways of being together? And all of the, you know, that kind of micro contracting that you describe, you know, like would it be okay if I share something about me now? That might be absolutely right for one person in one context, and another context it might be overkill. It might in itself feel a little bit oppressive, or someone's being too careful with me. And
absolutely, I mean, I do think about resourcing, you know, like sometimes people come with different levels of resource. People have different levels of resource and different levels of capability and development, and those are the complications around power. And I suppose the other word I think is generosity. So thinking about partnering and co-creative TA is having some need for generosity around the relating. I'm not sure, but thank you.
Nice proposition. Nice proposition. Thank you. Keith, any more thoughts from you?
I'm just more thinking a little bit, thinking about time, and wanting just to pick up on the final of the opening questions. I know we generated more questions, but going back to Rachel's point about script development very briefly, and I sort of feel like we've probably passed the point of breakout rooms. But also perhaps
I'm in agreement with you about that.
Yeah.
Someone else might disagree, but I'm in agreement with you about that.
And the other thing, just as a sort of process point, and I think Paul's talked about this, is that there will be other workshops. So this is again a bit of a taster, you know. So if people are getting both excited and maybe a bit frustrated about, oh well, there's more to talk about. There's power, and there's Martha Stark's taxonomy, and there's I'm sort of thinking, well, maybe that's one of the workshops we could talk about. Power, a co-creative approach to power, which I think would be a really interesting workshop. And always happy to talk about Martha Stark's taxonomy, which I like a lot, and I do think it's worth adding to. But I do, in terms of perhaps the sort of contractual bit, is to perhaps just pick up on the point about scripted. Is that okay with you, Graeme?
Fine by me, yes, go ahead.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm going to answer it very briefly, which is, so I think the original question was, how do we view script development? Can it be positive and or pathological? And clearly we are on the side of the angels, saying that it's both. It's one of these things where if we have the three ego state model is, you know, and the traditional model of scripts and the traditional model of games and so on, you know, has a certain resonance, and the traditional model of script has an implication that it's bad and that we should be script free. It's even in the exam handbook that candidates for the CTA should be as script free as possible, which suggests that the end goal of, you know, therapy is to be script free. And yet there's this other tradition which comes from Finita English and Bill Cornell particularly, which we talked about last time, and ourselves, which says, you know, script is always self-defining but only sometimes self-limiting, which is almost a quote from Bill's 1988 article, which was very influential on both of us. So I'd say, you know, briefly that it can be positive and it can be pathological, but what I don't think it can be is only pathological. So an example from my own life is, and I think for this quite from time to time, particularly when I'm getting into trouble or about to get into trouble, and I think my father in the Second World War was a conscientious objector, and he didn't talk very much about it, but it was clearly in we grew up with that sort of sense of, you know, both my parents were very liberal and encouraged, you know, thinking and you know, objecting conscientiously and so on. So it's a bit sort of in my bones, in my marrow. So I don't have a problem in objecting. Some people might say I certainly don't have a problem. I should probably stop it. But there is a sense in which, you know, you could think about that as a positive script, in the sense it gives me confidence to sort of say, even if I'm feeling a bit isolated or a bit alone, or I'm the only one saying this, that I can stand up. It's sort of almost like, you know, my father's got my back and so on. And I think that's, if you like, an example of a positive script. Of course, there's a negative element to that, or there could be a pathological element in that if that's the only thing I do in order to please my dad, you know, I just go on objecting even when I don't feel, you know, that's right. So, and that's to me the beauty of TA, because just as we have ideas about how to diagnose an ego state, which have 4 requirements, you know, we can do a full ego state diagnosis if we have those 4 requirements. We also have ideas about, you know, script, so that we can tell the difference between, you know, if like I'm racketeering in my objection, or if I'm objecting in an integrating adult way. So that's a sort of personal example which works for me.
Nice example. I'm thinking about that in terms of, I mean, I suppose I think of story, you know, script's a story. It's a story. Yeah. It's a way of joining the dots in our experience. So we have a way of telling the story, telling our narrative. And if we're lucky, some experiences, you know, we're too fixated, to struggle with to even story, you know, and Jeremy Holmes talks about this well in relation to, you know, how the stories we tell and the way we tell those stories are indicative of the attachment style that we might have adopted. So I think that, so I like this idea of, and again, it's like well or badly. So you have a story about your development. Do you use that story well? Do you use it, or do you use it badly? Do you use it to justify and just get into problematic situations over and over again that are no good for you and no good for other people? So I like this, love this idea of the finding the neutral in all of these concepts: ego states, transactions, games, and scripts. It was one of the things we really wanted to set out to do, was, hang on, can we just stop talking about what's going wrong? You know, and if we only think of games as pathological, if we only think of script as pathological, and these are the core pillars of our theory, then we're weighting it too much at a pathological end. And I think we wanted to find a way of articulating a story of transactional analysis that we could use to think about healthy processes as well as what goes wrong and where we get stuck.
Would you therefore say that as we experience a different type of relating together and strengthening the adult, integrating adult, would you describe that as creating a new script, a new positive script?
Yes, I would actually. You're certainly creating new experiences, and those new experiences become the dots that we might, join the dots. Remember that as a kid when all these dots and you put them in the right order, and then you suddenly have a rabbit. Wow. Well, it's a bit like when we're having an experience and it's affirming in some way or healing or in some way meaningful to us. We're creating a dot. A dot of a good enough experience that we might use to weave a different story about ourselves or the world. So yes, I do think of that process as script building, if you like.
A bit like
I'm really interested in it, I am. Because
Sorry, Andy.
I think really you kind of burn into traditional TA right on its head. I agree with you, because traditionally, like you say, TA was about doing therapy to make people script free. But I wanted more about helping people to write and know what my old James would call a winning script.
Yes. Well, even Byrne talked about putting a new show on the road. So we could even go back. So there's a lot in the literature, like a lot of these things that we've built on. The roots have been there right the way back to Byrne. We're just joining the dots in a different way and telling a different story. We're looking at the same kind of literature base, but we're telling a different story. So yeah, Byrne talked about putting a new show on the road.
Yeah,
I think that's. But so, what does the show look like? How would you describe the show? What's your story of, why is the show used? All of these are about creating a new story and a new way forward.
Yeah. So I can I can carry on being a therapist. I've still got a script.
Yes!
Thanks, Graeme.
Welcome, Andy.
Yeah, well, all it is a story, isn't it?
Yeah. From a more narrative perspective, script is, I mean, I suppose the only caution I'd have about the new script and, positive script is as long as that doesn't become fixed. I remember Adrienne Lee talking about the autonomy system. She used to draw the racket system or the script system and then sort of punch a hole through and go, so what's the autonomy? What's the equivalent? What are the reinforcing memories for autonomy and so on and so on? I think that's very useful as long as it doesn't become a thing that you put on the wall and say, this is me being autonomous, and in a rather fixed way. So I'd say yes. I'd also agree with you, Graeme, in response to what you were saying, Rachel. Yes, it can be, as long as it still becomes the subject of processing and renewal,
and evolving and
evolving, not a fixed, not a new fixed.
No, and you can have a second series, and you can have episode 10, and all of that. You can move on and evolve. Yeah.
But what do you think when you talk about the reinforcing memories in the script system? What you've been appointed of a new script is for reinforcing memories, be they fixation or interest. I kind of integrated into the adult in the process of writing a new script. Excuse me. Did you get that?
Yes.
Yeah. So then instead of having
the materials are integrated before you write a new script.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
If you were drawing an autonomy system, if you like, or a sort of process autonomy system, then the reinforcing memories would be a memory of an integrating relationship or an integrating moment, which actually goes back to what you were saying, Elaine, about the trauma. It's like even just one, going back to, that therapist accepted my trauma rather than made me suppress it or pat me on the head or whatever. That would be then a link to the new story. I can tell a different story about this. And it's choiceful, so I can tell a story that I remember having a conversation with my dad about, you know, circumstances under which I would fight, because in some ways I disagreed with his conclusion, but I liked and appreciated and still appreciate, although he's long gone, he's very present, you know, his courage and his example, if you like. So there's, you know, yeah, lots of nuancing of stories. And I really like the Jim and Barbara Allen's contribution to TA. They really put, I think, the sort of, I mean, we are very indebted to them for our sort of constructivist leanings, and Jim was very supportive of us. And they basically, you know, they say, look, script is a narrative, like it's a story, and it's a narrative therapy from a different perspective. And I also like your point, Graeme, is that, you know, we're not making this up. You know, everything we are saying and have developed has its origins in particularly Burns' own writings, and we often reference that and say, you know, this is that idea about the show on the road. You know, that's positive games, integrating adult, and so on.
I've often get the feedback that people are surprised when they get to learn more about co-creative TA, about how actually how Burnian it is.
Yeah. I was delighted to see it. Yeah, you know, Adrian's wheel of schools of TA.
All right.
And when I first saw that, I was curious because she had us as part of a constructivist tradition, but she also had me in the Burnian, in the classical school, and I went, yay, that's great, because I often say, you know, Burns said this and he did that, and going back to Burns' thing about, you know, diagnosis and so on. So I'm in at least 2 schools of TA, and probably radical psychiatry as well. I would make a bid for.
Coming back to you, Rachel, I know you. Any concluding thoughts, perhaps reflections on this question that you brought?
Well, I'm glad to say it was kind of what I was saying that you would say to my students.
Good.
You know us well.
Even though some of them disagreed. Yeah, a big discussion about whether script could be positive and whether you would say that. But I see it very much linked to narrative, and we're creating a new narrative, like you say, through our adult relating.
Also sounds like you've got an adult education view of education, when, you know, we can get excited about students disagreeing. That's for some of our colleagues, that's somewhat radical.
Well, actually, I found in preparing for my TSTA exams, I found the co-creative way of working really helpful for thinking about my teaching philosophy. You know, how we teach and why we teach, and why we don't want to work in the transferential relationship as trainers and supervisors.
Thank you.
Kia kaha. Stay strong.
We've got about 8 minutes left. Just wondering what else might need to happen in these 8 minutes by way of bringing our conversation here to a close. Anything anyone wants to say?
Ask a question.
Matt, hi Matt. Yes.
Hello. Do you think the reason why the co-creative philosophy metaphor has come about is to do with better outcomes for clients? Is it driven? So when we were talking about 1.5 person, 2 person in the start model, is that about a long-term better outcome, a different outcome, or what's your thoughts on that?
It's a great question. I love the idea. The sort of, when I hear outcome, I sort of think, oh yeah, it'd be interesting to research this more. But I certainly think the way one link, and it's only this, is that point that I made about the inefficiency and inefficacy of regressive work, because it sort of creates a dependency. And again, I'm drawing on Roger's critique. He was very critical of, you know, working in the transference simply because of, you know, this sort of, it felt like therapist centered, you know, and maybe even commercial, you know, like if you pay me, you know, your problems are so great that you have to come 4 days a week. So yeah. But I think I like the link. I suppose I would make a link that if what's that Fakatoki, which is a proverb about if you give somebody a fish, you know, give them a fish they can eat for a day, give them a fishing rod they can eat, you know, for life. It's sort of, it's like if we work from integrating adult and expanding integrating adult, then we can deal with the next problem, the next anxiety. Rather than feeling like we've got to go back to the therapist and say, oh, can you give me that repair again? So I guess I would link it to outcomes in that way. But I also stimulated by your question to think about, oh, wouldn't it be exciting if we could actually do some research about this and get clients' opinions? And as, of course, as more of you are doing co-creative TA, that's more possible. So thank you for that.
So I guess what you know, we made reference to Lebowski in our paper, didn't we, Keith, the original one, about, you know, the outcome research on the important significance of the relationship rather than the modality. I have to be honest, I can't say that's my main motivation. I mean, Keith and I have been talking about playing a little bit, as we do, about, so, you know, what is co-creative TA about? What was the, you know, we can come out with definitions, and but we were also reflecting that actually there's two friends on a training program trying to make sense of the theory. Fundamentally, I think there was something there about that. There was a plethora of ideas, different paradigms, different schools, different approaches, new stuff coming online all of the time, and you know, I needed to make sense of it. Yeah. And I think we were both in that position of, you know, being excited by stuff, being confused by stuff that seemed to contradict, trying to work out, well, how does this mean? Do we go this way? Do we go that way? Or do we form our own way? I think we went with the latter, you know, by, you know, taking our passion for TA and our love of mental gymnastics to you know, to actually have those kind of conversations, and well, this is what seems to make sense to us, and I think, if I'm honest, Matt, that's probably been our primary motivation, rather than being perhaps more led by, you know, oh, we want better outcomes for clients. That sounds much more noble an intent than I can honestly declare in terms of my motivation for writing and thinking and talking endlessly with Keith.
I think, I mean, I agree, and I think it was a bit even more serious than that, in that my recollection is that we had a bit of a crisis of faith, if you like, post CTA, because we did our CTA exams together. We sort of started together and then did other things, and then we came back, and so we did that. That was a 7-year journey, and then post CTA, about a year later, for me, I think 3 years later, we did the PTSTA, and I remember talking with you about being pretty at odds with aspects of TA. I've got about sort of 10 criticisms that I put in my introduction, and you were very influenced by Gestalt. I was very influenced by person-centered psychology, and it was almost as if, certainly from my point of view, I thought, if I'm going to be a PTSTA and indeed a TSTA, I've got to find a way to square some of these circles, as it were, or you know, to make my peace with TA and so on. So, and I agree with you, Graeme, that in a way, co-creative TA, another definition of co-creative TA, is it's the story of two guys who love each other dearly and who also disagree with each other dearly, and how they made their way with TA. And in that sense, I think it's a meta-narrative, and the message that I think a lot of people have got from that is something about the importance of your narrative. You know, so my curiosity, my interest is, what's your narrative with TA? How do you make peace with, you know, Burns' homophobia or sexism, or the contradictions in TA, or the pathologizing of students, or the, you know, the fact that it hasn't changed the world in 60 years, or the fact that it's still very, you know, as one person put it, white middle class tranquilizer. You know, all of those things. So yeah, I think that was part of our story. It's our way of making sense of this wonderful and strange thing called transactional analysis.
How you doing with that, Matt? Good.
Right, very substantial answer. Thank you.
Okay, guys, can I come in and remind us? I'm just conscious of the time.
Thank you, Paul.
And you know what Keith and Graeme, I think, are saying, and certainly what they finished off with at the end of the original TAG article, was that this is where we're starting from, and there's an opportunity over the coming 6 months with Keith and Graeme and a team of co-created practitioners, TA practitioners, to develop this more, because Keith and Graeme invited people to support the development of co-creative TA. So I think there's an opportunity coming up over the next 6 months to do that, with lots of you guys joining us on workshops, and to explore lots of the things that you've asked questions about today. And the schedule is beginning to form. We've got an outline basis of the schedule over the next 6 months. The 8 of us are actually putting workshop proposals into the schedule that we're building together. And I think, as Graeme and Keith have said tonight, we invite you to ask for workshops that you'd like to have some of us involved in, and to explore some of these concepts and models that you're coming up with, and some of the questions you're coming up with. So please, we will develop the schedule, the workshop schedule, and we will let you know what they are through the UCATA website. But please let us know if there's something that you want us to do, like power, yeah, or script, or narrative, or co-transferential relating, or whatever it is. If you give us a subject to do a workshop on that you're interested in, I'm sure we can come together and put one on, and you can join it, and we can explore it over 2 or 2.5 hours. Yeah.
Thank you. Well said, Paul. Thank you very much. So appreciate yourself and the rest of the Sixness joining us in this wonderful way. And thank you so much to all of you. I mean, it's your questions, your attention, your curiosity, your comments in the text, as well as what you're willing to say here in this space. This is how we are making these new dots and hopefully opening up new possibilities. And I am so excited that you're doing it with us. So I look forward to seeing you again in some other form over the next, I don't know, 6 months. How long are we going to take? 6 months or whatever, something like that.
Yeah. We think we start on the 16th of December if everything goes to plan, with a workshop on shared responsibility. And then it runs out over the next 6 months into June, when we progress through looking at the tenets and looking at how we put it into practice, and then looking at the meta levels. So we look forward to seeing you and joining us again.
Thank you. That's such an amazing project, and thank you again. And yeah, ngā mihi kia koutou, my greetings and thanks and respect to you all.